On today's episode, I talk with Natalie West. Natalie West is a clinical psychotherapist, self-image specialist, and speaker who has been helping individuals and organizations improve their mental and metabolic health for over 17 years. Now, obviously, on this episode, we're going to talk about mental health, self-image, and the range of aspects of psychotherapy. And specifically, we're going to dive into how nutrition and metabolic health affects mental health, which a lot of people don't always associate. So we're going to do a deep dive into that space, particularly around ancestral and animal-based nutrition and specific nutrients and how that influences your mental health. Before we jump into the episode, this podcast is brought to you by Vital Origin, Australia's best and most ethical animal-based supplement company, helping you add in nature's original superfoods back into your diet. And for all of our listeners, you can get an extra 10% off at checkout on all of our products using the code SOURCE10 at checkout. And if you could, it would really help out the channel if you can like and subscribe and leave us a comment or review on whatever platform you're listening to our podcast. All right, on to our show with Natalie West. Welcome to the Health from the Source podcast, where we're dedicated to educating people about health, ancestral nose-to-tail nutrition, regenerative agriculture, and the interplay between environment, health, and sustainability. All right, welcome to the show, Natalie. Thanks for joining us. Now, we've done a bit of an intro about your bio and everything already, but before we jump into all the details, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, your background, and how you kind of got into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure to talk to you. It's been a while.
It has.
In the making.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I've been in this space now for over 17 years. So I started really out of my corporate world background. I'd spent 20 years in corporate, both in C-suite kind of industries, and then I went into the music industry, and I loved it. But there was always this fascination with the mind and really watching people's behaviors. So that was quite an interesting, I guess, a pathway that opened up for me. Then I was like, you know what? I really don't want to work for anybody anymore. So after my first child, I decided that, I really wanted to find my path and my purpose and just do something that was really bigger than me. Because, when you're walking in corporate, there's really nothing to excel to help the world, right?
Yeah.
So I really just found my way with psychology to start with. And then that was great, but there was always just something missing. And it wasn't until I went to a seminar where I actually met a psychotherapist who was talking about the gut-brain axis and, how important it is to ask people, what they eat. And 17 years ago, that was pretty weird.
In
right?
Some circles, still weird. There's still a bit of hesitation, I guess, in approaching it from that perspective.
100%, and I was always looked at like I had two heads, like, why are you asking me that? But really, he really shone a light on a lot of the time it's not just in your head, right? It's in your gut. So that was a really amazing, again, by accident seminar that I went to see him. And that really just sent me down the path of really wanting to understand what we called back then was psychonutrition, which really, if we look back really far, it's been around since the 1920s. Don't know if a lot of people have heard of Abram Hoffer and Linus Pauling. They were really the pioneers of understanding, firstly, the power of vitamin C, but also food. So that led me just down a path, Richard, of really understanding, the psychotherapy elements of people's programming, but also too, it really led me deeper into, metabolic health, understanding now what we call nutritional psychiatry, which, Dr. Chris Palmer and Dr. Eid have been kind of the new modern pioneers of that field. And it just made sense, and even when I was doing the psychology part of, the typical psychology element, that's when I knew something was missing, because I guess also too, coming from a background where I've had family members that have been, mental health challenges and lots of disordered kind of patterns. And it really just started there. But all of that just made sense to me. And I'm like, wow, we have to put the full piece of the puzzle together, and it has to be both axes. It has to be, yes, understanding our patterning and our programming and our self-worth and our self-image and our value structures, but also too, what are we fueling and feeding and really nourishing ourselves with? So that's kind of really where it started, and it's just evolved from there. And it's just even, now moved into just, apart from just value structures with people's self-worth, but food behaviors, alcohol, all of those kind of things. So they're all steeped in the same thing.
Very much so. Yeah. I think originally, and maybe not in the very beginning, but it seems in medicine overall, I guess the reductionist view led to sort of a dichotomy between psychology and biology. And, they kind of separated them as if they were
They
different,
do.
but we know very much that, mind and body is much the same. So if you want to address one, you need to address the other. So it's nice to see. I think we're finally coming to that culmination of combining a more holistic approach of addressing mental health through physical health and vice versa. And nutrition obviously plays a very big part in
Oh,
that.
it's huge. And you're right. Like the old model is like your head's put over here and your body's over here, and it's totally separated. And that's why you'll long term really, really struggle to solve the whole problem, because we're human beings. We're, mind, body, spirit, and soul. So you've really got to look at all of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we're moving more and more in that direction. And, practitioners like yourselves and many of the pioneers are pushing that agenda forward, which is great. There's
Yeah.
probably still more work to be done, but I
Oh,
think we're seeing more and more improvement nowadays.
Absolutely. And it's always evolving. And, people even like, Ben Bickman and all of those real people that are just immersing themselves in really that mitochondrial health, which
Mm,
really is the root cause of all of it. And that's I guess the beauty of understanding kind of, the 1920s plus model, but now learning about the mitochondria in such a different way, which really fuels mental health. You can't have either one of them without holding hands together. Mental health is metabolic health and vice versa.
absolutely. Yeah. And it's been a vastly underutilized and underviewed perspective in overall health as well, not just mental health, but everything. But
Absolutely.
I want to, before we jump into a lot of the specifics of those types of things, I'm curious because it's quite a big jump to go from sort of C-suite corporate world into psychology and that. So, what was the shift for you going into that space? It sounds like you had some personal aspects and some family in that space. Is that what kind of drove you to move more in that space?
Yeah, well, I was really quite young when I used to kind of stand back and observe. And I actually thought I was adopted originally, because I was just like, who are all these people? What's going on here? It was
Sometimes
just
it
one
feels
of
that
the,
way with family.
I know, right? I'm like, if I belong here. But it was such a really, I think, my profession found me. Again, I think we all understand what that means. But for me, yeah, my mum's really struggled with mental health issues for a long time, and she still does. But I've also got to be really mindful that I'm a daughter, not a therapist, when it comes to my mum, and I'm
Yep.
sure a lot of people understand what that's like. People need to want to help themselves and value themselves, but you can just be there and hold space for people. But again, it was just the psychology element of why I'd looked at all of my aunts and my uncles, and some people didn't have problems and some did, but they all grew up in the same environment, right? So for me, it was very interesting. But I started at work when I was 17. Like, I started a sales role and just kind of left home and just really kind of deep dived into really making money and being a salesperson. And then it just evolved from there. But I always knew that health through food, it was funny actually too, growing up in the 70s, we always had meat on our plates, right? That was, I'm talking like steaks like this, right? That
Yep.
was a normal thing back then. So
Yep. Cooked
I
in
must,
butter or lard or
yeah. And
yeah.
I grew up with my grandparents feeding me tripe and offal, and that was standard for me. So clearly to where I am now, it wasn't a really big jump, because I knew that I really had a great foundation of metabolic health back then, but really didn't understand it. So, you know, learning that and having that environment instilled with me stayed with me the whole time. So it really wasn't until I kind of went into the corporate land, and then back then I also ended up in the bodybuilding industry, which I thought was the health industry, but that's really not true.
Yeah, it's often misperceived. Fitness and health, not always the same thing.
Really bad. It's actually a really disordered, mental health industry. And I think it's really, really rare to find anyone that doesn't come out with some kind of, mental or eating disorder. And that's where it led me. So, I had a very, very unhealthy relationship with food, but then obviously understanding the work that I do, it was my negative self-image based on that environment that I teach people with their own, 0 to 7, which is a really crucial years for us as kids, and it's what our environment kind of steeps us in, and our self-image is really developed by that, and most people unfortunately have a very negative and conflicted self-image. So for me it was just being in corporate, being in that, push, grind, because that's what you believe you have to do to be successful
Of
on the
course.
outside.
Yep.
Not on the inside. It's a very different thing.
Very much.
So yeah, Richard, it really just allowed me to go, well, I used food as a tool to lose weight, to get into my best, shape on the outside, but on the inside, not so good shape. And after doing that, in getting out of that industry after 3 years, I was a judge for a while, and just the whole psychology, and that's just kept coming back to me the whole time about people's thinkings, behaviors, why they're doing it, and experiencing it for myself. I walk my talk. Like, what I teach is exactly how I live, and the protocols that I work with people is what I use, and that's really what helped me get to where I am today, both mentally and metabolically. Bodybuilding got me into a very unhealthy metabolic state, to the point where I was insulin resistant and pre-diabetic. Looked great on the outside, but not so good on the inside.
Yeah, and that might surprise a lot of people, right? Because we think of metabolic health overall, lean, thin, fit
Yeah.
overall, but there's often more complex and nuanced underlying physiology that's going on there where, yeah, the I guess common sense perspective doesn't always line up for that for a lot of people. And I think it would shock them to realize that a lot of the time. But the psychology is an important part, and I've had some of my own clients as well in the bodybuilding space, and particularly women, I feel, can be quite a tricky space for them
Yeah.
because it is all about body image, and it's very particular and very critiquing in that space.
Yes.
And I can see how that can very easily go down the wrong way. And then there's the whole aspect of disordered eating, which can very easily fall into that as well.
Yeah, and there's no freedom in it at all. Like, you think that there is, but the mental and metabolic construct that it puts you in is, and even, me prior to me going carnivore, which was nearly 5 years ago this year, still looking at calories in, calories out, and weighing food and all of that kind of thing, and even knowing I know what I know. There was still this cognitive dissonance of, especially when I was like, oh my God, am I going to die without plants?
Yep. And I think that cognitive dissonance is still rampant in a lot of places. I'm curious, how you came to the carnivore diet. Obviously, it sounds like, in your family history, there's a lot of meat always there. But
Yeah.
how did you come to, incorporate a more carnivore approach into what you were doing?
Yeah, so it was just prior to, well, when we kind of went into lockdown with the first round of COVID, and I'd always kind of been paying attention because I was eating every couple of hours, and it was really carby and protein but not too much, and I'd always be hungry. Like, literally I would eat, and then within about a 45-minute period I was like hangry, and as a bodybuilding term, that kind of is worn as a badge of identity, and it's really not good.
Hmm.
But I always knew something was off, and I'm like, okay. So then I went and had a blood test, and that's really when it came all to the front, was when he said to me, he goes, "You're actually, insulin resistant." And I'm like, wow, okay, that makes sense. Now I know what I ate, and then my insulin would, the carbs would take you up, and then you drop, and then you'd be hungry again. So it's just
Yeah.
always searching for something. And my friends would make fun of me because they'd be like, you'd need to bring a lunchbox with you when we go out, because you'll just eat and then you'll be hungry again.
I used to be the same.
Yeah, yeah, right. So, but this is a thing, the doctor even had said to me, like, "I will just keep an eye on it." And I'm like, yeah, you don't know me very well. That's not going to work. We're not just going to keep an eye on it. We're going to change it.
Yeah.
So immediately I knew that it was the carbohydrates, because obviously, any kind of type 2, even pre-diabetic is carbohydrate intolerance for a long period of time. So I just went, no, I'm not doing that. So literally the next 2 days, I just went full in, straight into, carnivore way of eating. And then 12 weeks later, I went and had a blood test and all good, all gone.
Amazing. Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
power of food, right? It can happen very quickly, and there's still, I think they're coming around now, even, the Australian Diabetic Association, American Diabetic Association, it took them a long time to even recognize low carb
correct.
into an approach for
Yes.
managing diabetes, let alone obviously zero or carnivore approach. But it takes a while before the industry sort of shifts and comes across, even though low carb approach has been around for a very
Oh,
long time and research has been
long
growing.
time. And this is the other thing too, we look at low carb and it's been around, as you said, really, I think maybe 2030s when they started using it as the epilepsy way,
Hmm.
and really we've got to take knowledge from that and go, well, hold on, if in some people that medication is not working where you can put your brain into ketosis and you stop having fits, there's information there that we really need to look at. But the other thing is, thank goodness with, people like Dr. James Muki, who really was the pioneer of really getting the Diabetic Association in Australia to look at low carb and the power of low carb. But not just even with insulin resistance, my asthma disappeared, my hay fever disappeared, my skin, my hair, everything just changed. But just my energy. And, I still weight train, but I weight train from a very different protocol now. It's a totally different way. It took me a while though, I will admit, like
Hmm.
going from carb to being, in a fat adapted state, that was 3 months of like, what is going on?
Yeah.
It took me a while, but now there's nothing like it. It's so powerful. And even with clients of mine that are, really not say hardcore trainers, but they're just like, you have no idea the difference in energy when you're fat adapted and when you're feeding and fueling yourself correctly. I'm like, I know, right? It's
Yeah,
amazing.
can be night and day difference. I think a lot of people are scared of the transition because
Yes.
you do have to do it appropriately, especially if you've had a
Yes.
lifetime of, processed food, excess processed carbohydrates. Your metabolism's not
Absolutely.
quite there yet. There is a period of adaptation, but yeah,
Yep.
once you come through that, it can be quite a night and day difference for people. And even in the training space, I forget his name now, is who's the ultra endurance athlete who he's doing zero carb carnivore approach, and he's one of the top ultra endurance athletes now. So it's definitely moving in that direction where people are recognizing the power of doing it. I
Yes.
think athletes especially, they seem to have still a bit of that cognitive dissonance, like you said, of not quite getting there
I
yet,
need
but
my carbs.
yeah, very much so. But for overall health, I think, yeah, it can be quite a powerful therapeutic tool for a lot of people, especially the keto as well.
Oh,
Again, when we're talking about metabolic aspects, but even for cognitive health and mental health,
oh,
it can be a massive help for a lot of people. The ups and downs of blood sugar spikes and drops, people don't realize that that can be such a core component of why they're feeling the way they feel
yeah.
mentally, right? I mean, again, they don't
Absolutely.
necessarily associate the physical with the mental, and I think we have to start recognizing that they all tie in, like we said.
Correct. And that's, I think, the biggest part of really making sure that the information is out there around the power of really putting any kind of way of eating as a nutritional therapy protocol, and I'll always say, you mostly never hear me say the word diet, like carnivore diet, because I know that diet triggers a lot of people in their past patterns around dieting, because diets you have to come off because they're not maintainable. And if diets worked, you would do one and you would never have to do it again, right? But
Yeah.
when I use that as a comparative with the way of carnivore, is everyone has to understand that they must put it as a value and it must be anchored at an internal value for mental and metabolic health, not negotiable. Because when you do it that way, then it's an internal feeding, fueling structure to keep you at your ultimate, to actually thrive. If anything is embedded and anchored outside, it never lasts. So it's like even when some of the carnivore community groups that I'm in and people will ask, like, give me your pros and your cons and make me motivated. I'm like, it's not going to work. It's great. It's great to hear other people's experiences. However, it must come from, why are you doing it? What is the value attached to it? But it's got to be linked to your mental and metabolic health. And I know it sounds strange, but you would think that most human beings would value their mental and metabolic health, but they don't, because most of the patterning and programming that we have around food is being used as entertainment or punishment, to go on a diet, to restrict calories, to make your body look a certain way. But if you actually put your mental and metabolic health first, your body will follow.
Absolutely.
And the value structures that most humans have are not with a relationship with themselves. They're all externalized.
Yeah, I think it's such a powerful aspect. Mindset is always first, and sure it's where you spend a lot of your time working in. But
Yeah.
there's the component of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivators, and I think a lot of people rely on the extrinsic initially, but they
Yes.
haven't spent the time, like you said, to figure out what is their why is it important to them, what is this going to bring to their life, and I think that's where aspects of psychotherapy and those types of strategies can really shed a light for people to be able to have that mindset shift, to be able to create long-term change. And for
Yeah.
a lot of people, without that initial shift, they're just going to be in that typical cycle of on and off diets, yo-yo dieting. It worked for a little while, they come back. So they really
Yeah.
need to tap into, I guess, their underlying why. And I imagine that's probably what you spend a lot of time working with people on.
I do. And it's a lot of about releasing the thoughts, feelings, and actions and opinions of people outside of yourself. Like whenever we're going through, whether it's a conscious or unconscious pattern and the value structures and where they've been embedded, we have to also understand that your mental and metabolic health isn't up for negotiation with anyone outside of yourself.
Yeah.
And really what goes on your plate is no one else's business. If you are healing and that's what you need to do to heal, there should never be any, crowd on the outside telling you that, have one, donut, it's not going to kill you, or have one glass of vodka. And it's like, no, you've got to really be able to value yourself enough to say, no, thank you, or no, it won't kill me right now, but it's damaging the commitment to myself. And that's the other thing. No one has a commitment to themselves to be able to use their voice to say, no, thank you, I don't want that.
Yeah, I think that's such a difficult thing for a lot of people. I see this all the time as well, where modern society and what is normal now, we've accepted things that are grossly terrible for your health.
Yes.
And yet, when people try to make the change towards living healthier life, that seems to ostracize them, and they suddenly become the abnormal individuals for trying to live a better, more optimal life for themselves. And it
Correct.
becomes very difficult because everyone else around them, maybe because it challenges their own beliefs and they have their own issues. But I can see how so many people struggle with that because of the sort of societal norms around them. It makes it very, very tricky.
It does. And it's really quite interesting when we look at where we have to justify to anyone as to why we don't want to drink alcohol or we don't want to eat sugar or have, pizza or really bad carbohydrates that we know that really don't serve us in any way, shape, or form. But it's just because we're so, again, culturally, we like to be included. We don't want to, not fit in. But hold on, if you're, for example, a celiac, right, and someone offers you a pizza that's full of gluten, you'll say no with no problem. There's no difference in understanding the value shift of there as saying, no, I don't want that alcohol. Thank you very much. But it takes time, but it does change, but you've got to be able to be really in your own value structures to know, no, this is why I'm doing it. And really your opinion around why I don't want a donut is irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think people need to develop their own personal value system. And that's something that I've done and I have some of my clients do as well, of actually, writing it down and figuring
Yes.
out what are their personal values. Is that something that you would do as well?
It's a really huge part, Richard, of what I do. Because the thing is, we can have conscious values and we can have unconscious values, which can cause conflict within
Mm,
ourselves. So, we'll also then what we do, we tend to change and shift our identity or our value structures to appease others, which eventually hurts us and it harms us in the way that we need to then own. Because the full ownership of what we choose has to come back to ourselves. It doesn't matter whether someone offers you something, you've got to be able to say, no, thank you. If you make a choice to choose, then we've got to go through that. But it's very empowering. And instead of going around it and blaming someone else, you've got to go through it. But the biggest value structure is the relationship with self. No one has it. We have a lot of relationship values externally, like, for example, if you think about the word love or trust or respect, they're always anchored externally because that's how we value other people, correct? But if we actually look internally, a lot of the time, they don't exist within ourselves. So like self-love, a lot of people, when I work with them, they actually feel physically ill when they have to actually say that they are proud of themselves or they love themselves, because it doesn't exist. And again, respect, kindness. Like, I always say to people, how kind are you to you? And they're like, no, not really. But they can be really kind to other people. So it is a lot of that unconscious deep work around understanding, shifting and changing, and actually creating and living from your own value structures that you've developed, not the ones that you've been given. Because most of our operational system is literally that 90% of unconscious pattern behavior, which we're in autopilot mode, which we've been given to by our authority figures. So most of the way we work in the world and every single day is based on those values.
Yeah.
And
it's cultural
emotions anchored in food. Now, that's the most thing we work with, right? Is food or alcohol or attachments. It doesn't really matter what it is. They're all steeped in the same thing. We eat through our emotions. We drink through our emotions. We go around them. We anchor it externally with one of those tools or sources, but we're not actually learning the why behind what we're doing it. And there's a pain pleasure loop that happens. So, we think that, I'll just have that, piece of cake because, I'm going to reward myself. You're not a dog. Don't reward yourself with food. Like it's true. Like, we learn that though as children. We're given treats, or, you fall over, oh, here's a lollipop or whatever it may be. That's where we learn the value of, hold on, if I'm any human, doesn't matter what culture we're in, if we're happy, we're sad, we're indifferent, we eat or we drink.
From a very young age, that programming starts. I think in the parenting world, there's definitely a shift moving away from those types of things now. But for so much of modern society, those are deep ingrained cultural norms, and a lot of people are programmed. So how do you overcome that? Is this where, I guess, the psychotherapy and the nutritional psychology comes in? And we've said that word a couple times. Maybe if you could explain what psychotherapy is to people who are maybe not familiar with what that is.
Yeah. So psychotherapy is a particular module that we use to look at unconscious patterning. So we've got CBT therapy, which is, neuropsychology therapy, where you go and talk and things like that. And you go through really, I guess, what's true, what's not true. Depends on the person, because every single person's unique. So for me, I don't do a one size fits all. I have to understand how someone's minds work, what it sounds like to them, what it sounds like to me. And then I use particular models of structure of telling them, okay, so if someone says to me, I don't know how to be kind to myself, I'm like, well, what does that look like? So what we've got to do is wait for the unconscious part of the mind to actually pull out of a filing cabinet what that means and what it looks like and where it started. So really, if I get everyone to think about a big white room, right? And on one side of the room, we've got huge filing cabinets with file after file after file. That's all of that patterning that we've been brought into and grown up in our environment. On the other side of the room, we've got empty filing cabinets, right? All the drawers are empty. So really what I do is I work with my clients to understand what all of these filing cabinets currently that they're operating on. Now, in between those two filing cabinet spaces, there's a huge space of what I call the unknown, which is the unfamiliar. Oh, that's scary to the mind because we don't like it. We're like, we're not in our comfort zone, right? So we'd rather stay in our non-valued, bad pattern behaviors of familiarity, even though we know it's not serving us. Because this is the other thing too. I hear a lot of people say to me, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I keep doing it. Why am I keep doing it? The reason is because the unconscious filing cabinets have not been given any other way to operate through what does it look like, sound like, feel like, then what is the outcome or the evidence of that, right? So if you think about your mind as a computer, because it pretty much is, that's the way it operates. If you're creating the same data day in, day out on a waking state of hypnosis, because we all hypnotize ourselves every day. So part of the psychotherapy that I also use as well, I use a hypnotic part as well. because I'm also trained in clinical hypnosis and hypnotherapy. So they kind of go hand in hand. So really what we're doing, we're getting the mind and the people to understand how we reframe in that space and start creating brand new files with new thoughts, feelings, patterns, and actions and evidence and new data, so that you're operating consciously, not unconsciously. So a lot of that work comes from, working through what pops up with people. I hear certain things. Also be really mindful. Language is very powerful. So what you tell yourself is exactly what will be created. So if you use the same language data, you're going to get the same evidence over and over and over. So, it really is quite an amazing process for people to go through, because then they start to understand, oh, hold on, it's not me. I'm not broken. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just that I have no concept of what's been going on and what my patterning and behavior is.
Yeah, people often, and I think it's just due to human nature, we tend to label ourselves and we get attached to these labels that we provide. And then instead of associating what is happening around us to us as just everyday happenings, we associate that with our character and with
Yes.
our personality. And then therefore you think that you can't move forward from there, which is very tricky for people. So you have to sort of reprogram that, which is a big component. And again, until that shift happens, it's very difficult for people to move to the next step.
It absolutely is. And it really is quite an interesting way of looking at it from what you've just said then too, because a lot of people are so living by their identity, and that's very comfortable, but they know it doesn't serve them. But it's like whether you've had anxiety or depression or a certain, identity attachment to something like that, to move out of that, your mind's like, oh, I don't know who I am without any of that. Right. So that's why we have to kind of, in the beginning, when I work with people, it's one foot in familiar and 1 foot out. So it's kind of a bit of a hokey pokey, I call it.
Yeah. It's the art of being a clinician.
Sorry?
It's the art of being a clinician, is finding that line to get people to move towards where we need them to be.
Correct. So, and also too, for them to understand the automatic reactions also that they have in their body. So, when we're in resistance or in reaction instead of responding, and, really understanding that our environment externally, this is the other thing too, we live through our environment, right? We're literally driven by an external environment, which doesn't serve us. So in another element of the work that I do that we anchor with values, it's getting you back into your internal environment. So instead of cause and effect externally from your environment, which then sends you on particular patterns and behaviors, we flip that around to make sure that your actual internal environment, you're the one that's causing the effect in the way that you choose through your new conscious patterning and behaviors, but also to not being in reaction, being responsive and responding to the data.
It's a concept like mindfulness is a similar approach, right? Of living mindfully so that you can act instead of react.
Correct. Yeah. But also to understand what's going on in here. Like, it's quite funny. Like, I'll have a lot of people say, oh yeah, I think I know where that comes from and, why. Then when we actually really get to the root cause of it, a lot of the time it's like, oh, actually, that's not what I thought it was. Something else will pop up. But it's kind of like, if you think about a whole row of dominoes. Now, if we use CBT therapy, if you had 50 dominoes in front of you, you'd have to talk through each 50, right? That's a long time in therapy. talking. So what I do, we find the number one root cause of the domino, right? We go into that, bypass the consciousness so that doesn't get in the way, because we know why it gets in the way, because it's like, oh, this is too difficult, it's too hard, it's too emotional. So when we get through that, that knocks over the rest of the dominoes. So, that's when it all starts to make sense.
Amazing. I'm sure we could go on a lot about this, but I do want to touch onto the nutrition side, given that that's a core component that we talk about. So obviously you've kind of had your foray into carnivore, and this is something that you use. How did you first start applying, I guess, this more animal-based ancestral approach, or often called like a species appropriate diet?
Yeah. So really, if I go back even with my original training, it was low carb back then. So there was really no huge jump. It was just about, getting new information. And this is the thing, if you're a clinician and you're really set in a certain way or a certain set of training and you're really closed off to looking at information, that's really not going to benefit you or your clients. So you've really got to be very open-minded to say, you know what, wow, even experience your own cognitive dissonance and go into it and go, wow, what is this creating a belief here in me? And is this really true? So for me, it didn't really, well, it wasn't a huge jump, if that makes sense for me to go, right, well, it was already low carb, high protein. The only thing I think that really has shifted is more fat based than the training in kind of that old low carb modality. So really, anyone that knows me or watches my work, they're pretty clear. And they know, what my protocol is when it comes to nutrition. So again, though, every single person is unique. So we'll have to look at, what's going on individually for them mentally and physiologically, and, what's going on in their gut, so we've got to treat those quite specifically. Some of my clients who I work with that are kind of, in the alcohol attachment space. So that will be directly into no carb, zero carb pretty quickly, because the power of ketosis in cravings and getting the brain into a different operating fuel is really important for people that are high alcoholic use. Same with eating disorders, disordered eating patterns, and sugar addiction and carb attachments. So if I've got someone that's, depressive, anxious, depending on, their self-image, we'll start probably with low carb, see how they go. And then the more that they get into that kind of lower space of ketosis, then we'll just see how we go. And then sometimes a lot of them go, you know what? I don't really need the vegetables. I really like the meat and the fat. And it's really powerful too, Richard, when people actually understand the power that they have in their hands to heal themselves and actually to go, wow, look what I did. I give them the tools and the strategies, but they actually do it. They're the ones that go, wow, I've made myself feel like this, because they follow a protocol, but then that protocol just becomes very familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a big difference between the, I guess, conventional allopathic model is that, they seek to treat right away. So, they're providing something like a prescription or
Yes.
a surgery or some kind of treatment without necessarily, and this is obviously a general statement, not always the case, but without empowering the individual to figure out how they can enact change in their own life to bring forward what they need to heal. It's a very
Correct.
different approach.
Yeah. And it's something that, if we look at, I guess, modern society and the medical world and the psychological world, it's very disempowering. When you hear clients that are told that, if you've got type 2 diabetes, oh, you've just got to manage it. And, if you eat too many carbs, just shoot yourself up some more insulin. I was just like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
I'm like, are you
Completely missing the
kidding
root
me?
cause perspective, right?
Oh gosh. And even with depression and things like that, for example, I've had a lot of clients that it's quite interesting when they realize that the mental health capacity of it, when they just feed and fuel themselves, like half of the clients that I work with, it all disappears. And they're like, I just can't believe that I don't want to talk about that stuff anymore. I'm like, right.
Do you find it's a factor of removing specific foods? Is it an aspect of, I guess, metabolic regulation through low carb, or is it introducing nutrients that perhaps they were deficient in? What do you think is sort of moving the needle there, or all the above?
It's all of the above, really, Richard. And a lot of it is just really educating people to understand what food is and what food isn't, and what food like substance does. Like a lot of people will say to me, oh, my diet's really good. And then we'll pull it apart. And then it's like, it's just sugar and sugar and sugar and more sugar.
Yeah.
And then they wonder why they're on this huge roller coaster all the time. So it really just does come down to education and explaining, what amino acids do and, what. So, for example, like you need tryptophan to create serotonin, which then serotonin is made in your gut. So, if you're going to eat inflammatory foods and which then exacerbate inflammatory thoughts, that's going to be a problem. So, you're going to be losing all of that amazing, mechanisms that your body is designed to do. And food and what you drink has a direct impact on your mental and metabolic health. It's just, that's the way it is. So, you can have depression and go to therapy and talk about it for 20 years, but then if you're going home and eating McDonald's and, crap every day, How do you think that's going to heal you? It's not. So I just love seeing my clients be empowered and actually go, wow, if I eat that, then I feel like this. If I eat that, wow, then I feel like this. So it's really allowing them to get into their body, which is a huge another part of the way that I work. So
Yeah,
it's not just
fantastic.
about here. It's
Yeah.
like, how did that make you feel? What did you feel? Like, oh, I felt like rubbish. Okay, great.
Again, I think it's that aspect of people not associating one with the other. So, food, digestion, everything else that was sort of separate from psychology. And I think
Yeah,
that's one of the amazing things now with the nutritional psychology, nutritional psychiatry space is recognition of how nutrition and nutrients play a role in mental health massively. And, I've seen a lot of the literature, particularly around anxiety and depression
yeah,
in relation to animal-based nutrients, right? So like
yeah,
B12, iron,
yes.
anyone who's deficient in B12 or iron, we know that they're at a massively increased likelihood of anxiety and depression.
Correct, 100%. And when we talk about, it's funny actually. I was listening to someone this week, and they were like, "Oh, I really crave spinach." I'm like, "No, it's not spinach you're craving. You're actually craving heme iron."
Yeah,
That's the difference, right? No one
yeah.
craves spinach. It's your body telling you need iron, right? And you're deficient. So really, it's also the nutritional psychology part of it is people understanding, well, why am I eating and then going to the fridge an hour later, and why do I want something sweet? One, it's a habit, one, it's a pattern, but also two, it's emotionally anchored.
Mm,
It's like, well, if you are happy, you'll eat the ice cream. If you're sad, you'll eat the ice cream. But there's another deep root cause there because you know that it's not good for you.
yeah.
Right. So it's really just getting them very involved within themselves so that they become so aware of their observational patterns that they're not involved in them, they're just watching them, then they shift the pattern and then it just becomes a new wired state.
How do you feel a lot of your clients or when trying to make that shift? Because obviously the narrative in the conventional space right now is more plant-based, red meat will kill
Oh,
you,
yeah.
saturated fat
Yeah.
is bad, those types of things.
Yep.
So how do you navigate that to get people to incorporate more animal-based foods into their diet?
Well, again, they'll watch me for a while and then they'll do a little bit of their own research. And I'll always say to people, you know what? This is what we'll talk about. You go and do your research. I'll give you some links that you can go to, but I want you also to deep dive into the reality of what you've said and where have you got that from? So, most of them will say to me, "Oh, my GP told me." I'm like, "Okay, cool. Was it a functional GP? Was it a GP changing nutrition?" They're like, "Oh, no, no, no." I'm like, "Okay, great." So it's really just having a conversation like that. But I think by the time generally people reach me, they're at a point where they've tried everything. They've tried the veganism, they've tried everything. It's not working. So it's just about making sure that they're supported in that, really the belief and the psychology part of it. But also, too, I have an amazing array of functional practitioners, doctors that I use for bloods, and we work so well as a team. So when they're working with me, but they've also got another functional GP doctor that's working with them well, the whole story then starts to play out, and they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'm not going to die."
Fantastic. I think that's such an
Even
important part.
It is, but even with cholesterol, as you were saying before, with B12 and iron, especially, for women, but it's obviously important for every human being. But it is also about understanding that cholesterol is such an important part in our body, and our bodies are designed to make it. And it's not by accident that most of the rich, nutritious food that we need has cholesterol in it, right?
Yeah. Well,
Nature
this
doesn't
is
make a mistake.
that's I guess the species appropriate diet or this aspect of ancestral health, which I imagine most people that would be listening to this are somewhat familiar with it, given that it's sort of a core principle that we believe in. But
Yeah,
that I guess common sense perspective, again from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make sense that foods that we've eaten for probably millions of years that we evolved on, how could they all of a sudden in the last 1 to 2 generations be the cause of all the disease we see now? It just doesn't quite make sense. And
correct.
yet that that thought in the mainstream space seems to be very difficult for people to understand. I'm not sure why, but I guess what's your take on that whole perspective?
Well, I guess, the cultural aspect or the programming around, big pharma and all of the pressure that's created on doctors who aren't towing the line in relation to, if someone's got high cholesterol, then, you have to put them on a statin. And it's really true. Like if I look at my grandparents and they ate fat that coming out their earballs, right?
Yep.
Not once was there ever a discussion on, high cholesterol and statins and all of those kind of things, back then. And realistically, we understand why, because I think over the last couple of years, I think the veil is kind of slowly dropping, and we really have to be very clear on, hold on, what's the agenda here and what's the narrative? And even with some studies, right, we really got to pull them apart and say, well, who paid for them? Even the ridiculous one just recently with the Netflix series,
Oh,
it
yeah.
is
Yeah.
propaganda. But, for me, it's always about getting clients to their best optimal thriving space. And, for the original protocol, yeah, that's 6 months of literally healing your body psychologically and metabolically, and getting people in front of you that actually know the difference between what's an agenda and what isn't, and how to actually maintain a correct state of metabolic health for you. And bloods don't lie. I always say too, like, it's funny, even today, like I said, 5 years in, people always say to me like, oh, that can't be healthy. I'm like, do I look sick to you?
Yeah. Yeah, again, is that discordance, and I see this all the time with people as well. And I know in the cholesterol space, it's a big part. And um, Dave Feldman now is
Yeah.
releasing quite amazing research into cholesterol and these lean mass hyperresponders. And if you're a healthy individual with high cholesterol, is that a
Yes.
problem? But there seems to be often people make this shift to a more low carb, keto, carnivore approach. They feel amazing in
Yes.
every aspect. Everything feels great, their symptoms have improved or completely diminished, but then they go get their blood test and their cholesterol, their LDL is a little bit high, and then everyone freaks out over that. And it's I could see where it comes from, because again,
Yes.
that's the conventional training that they've perhaps had. But
Correct.
it's interesting to see how people can respond to these types of things psychologically when they feel amazing, and this one marker might throw them off the whole thing, which yeah, sometimes is for the detriment of their own health. But I agree, I think the for the vast majority of things, the bloods don't lie, particularly when we're looking at things like B12 and iron.
Yep.
And we see, it's very simple that if you're not consuming animal-based products in your diet, a simple active B12 and iron panel, it's quite surprising how many people are actually deficient. I see it quite a lot.
Yes.
Male, female, obviously more with female, but there's an extremely high rate now because of this narrative and the propaganda and everything that's out there, where
Correct.
people are shifting towards that plant-based diet, and then they inevitably eventually end up with some nutrient deficiencies. But a lot
Well,
of
they will, and it doesn't take that long. And I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago about it. Where if there's so many vegan recovery groups and so many dysfunctions of metabolic health in that space, and if you look at moving from, say, a SAD diet or even a plant-based diet into carnivore, technically, if we're removing fruit and sugars and carbs and plants, your mind would generally say you should get really sick. You should not get better. You should not reverse your insulin resistance or your autoimmune disease or whatever it may be. So again, we've got to go, well, okay, why? Yep. Have a lot of answers to that. But going back to looking at that plant-based category and even, veganism as the next step, it's quite funny when the belief structures of those things are so embedded in the animal part of it, which I totally appreciate. And that's why I always support regenerative and, grass-fed beef, and really understand where your meat comes from. That's also about ownership, right? But again, the belief of that in holding steady versus, hold on, your health is deteriorating, your bloods are deteriorating, but you believe that that's the best course of action for you, and you're tired, your hair's falling out, your skin looks pale, you can't function. But the belief, this is where the power of the mind really shows up, around that core anchor of, nope, it's about the animals. But in the meantime, as a human who you're operating in a day-to-day basis, you're absolutely deteriorating.
Yeah, and I think the it's the aspect of labels and ideologies as well, right? And this is a big problem in veganism, where a lot of people buy into the culture and they associate now themselves as a vegan,
Yeah,
and it's very hard to move out of that. And it seems that a lot of people that try to move out of it again get ostracized by the community, and it
they
can be
do.
quite terrible actually, even if
Yeah.
they're making a choice that they feel is for the betterment of their own health. And
Yes.
so it can be quite difficult for people because yes, there's all the programming and propaganda, and even when they want to make a choice, it's hard because now they're associated with this ideology of who they are, and then this whole community then looks down on them if they make a
Correct.
shift. So I can understand, and often people are trying to make that choice from a place of, compassion. They either for ethical or sustainable purposes.
Absolutely.
I completely understand that, but sometimes, yeah, people, you need to make a choice about what's right for your health, and even that, people tend not to think about the sort of secondary and tertiary effects. If you're unwell and unhealthy, you're now a larger burden on the healthcare system.
Yes.
That healthcare system has a carbon footprint as well,
Correct.
and even from the regenerative and sustainability perspective, we can talk about obviously least harm done, what's actually better for the environment, plant-based monocultures versus regenerative
Absolutely.
agriculture. So I think it's definitely a journey for people, but there is a very difficult mindset shift for people to move away from that space.
Yeah. And, I'll always, as a value, I'll always say that if you've eaten a certain way and it's been plant-based and it's not working for you, and you have to eat an animal to survive and to thrive, you have to eat an animal. An animal has to die for you to be able to thrive. You're here in this life. You don't get a do-over. So it's right now, and there's enough studies now to even in older people who have been plant-based for a very long time, sarcopenia and bone problems and fractures. And do you want to get to that point when you're 80 and then you're falling apart, but that belief structure that you've held clear, I don't know, what quality of life do you want to have?
Yeah,
It's a difficult one, but it's very similar though to the same with alcohol culture. You say no, and your peers will turn on you and call you a wussy and man up and all those
very true.
ridiculous
Very true.
ridiculous statements. It's the same thing where people have to navigate that. And but what I do find though with a lot of my clients and just even people that I know, and a lot of my friends have now moved into the carnivore space because they've seen the power of it. It literally elevates and vibrates at a very different level from a mitochondrial point, but even who you connect with, it's very different. The energy that you hold is a whole different space.
Mm. Yeah, I think the environment and the people that you surround yourself with makes such a difference, and it makes the shift a lot easier, right? Eventually, or inevitably, humans are social beings, and so
Yes.
we do want to feel connected, and we want to feel part of something, and so it helps massively to have that environment and that support around you. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it can be very lonely and very hard to make the
Well,
shift towards better health.
the other thing is too, is your culture. And if you go out with friends and you're eating and, like really there's protein on menu, it's not that hard. But if you make it a big deal and you open the door for people to criticize or give your opinions, that's going to happen. But it's all about shifting the mindset between what's connection and versus what are you using as an anchor to connect. So that's why when people move into changing anything to do with their eating or even removing coffee, there's such an incretive pattern of repetition that the minute that you move that, the mind's like, oh, I've got a blank space. What do I do here? And then people go, I don't really know what to do. So they'll just continue doing the same thing because it's comfortable. It takes time to be out with a group of people. You have to be uncomfortable. That's where your growth is. If you say, no, not eating that, or I don't want to drink that, you do it a couple of times and then you actually understand the power that you hold within yourself. But then also, too, when you go into any new environment, you're like, oh, that's normal now. I don't need to worry about it. And honestly, most people don't care. You care more that you think what they're thinking about you and they're thinking about themselves. Trust me.
Yeah, yeah. Most of us, and this is the aspect of anxiety, right? Most of us are stuck in our heads thinking that
Yeah,
everyone's looking at us or thinking about us, but most often they're not. They're sort of in their own world thinking about their own things.
correct.
Mm,
Correct. So, when you say no, don't worry about it. Let it go.
yeah. It's difficult. I can see, people like to stay in their comfort zone, and I think it takes practice to get used to being uncomfortable. You kind of have to take that first step. One aspect that I wanted to ask you about in relation to, I guess, society as a whole now is
Yeah.
how how you see social media play into this whole aspect now, because obviously when we talk about mental health
Yeah.
and cultural norms and all these things now, social media is such a big component of that. What's your take on how that's sort of influencing the way we see people's health, mental health, all of those?
Yeah, it's huge. One thing I find is the fact that if you're coming from a very poor and conflicted self-image about yourself externally, internally, social media can have a huge detriment, and it can be very deleterious to how you see yourself and how you feel about who you are. And never, I guess, from a society of social media and culturally, we're always comparing about, what my life looks like, why I don't have that. And that just shows that, you're in lack all the time. So you're then going to feed that addiction process. And it is an addiction. So being on social media constantly is hitting your dopamine centers like sugar does. It's the same process. So really what we've got to do is understand, right, it's a tool. And look, don't get me wrong, I love social media. Like, we wouldn't have connected if it wasn't for social media. And I think
Yeah.
just collectively, it's such an amazing tool if used from the correct mental space. So if you've got a very strong value structure within yourself and a very strong self-image, you can look at the things on social media and not be triggered by them. You can go, oh, yep, that's cool, but I know who I am. Nope, that body looks great, but mine's great. Mine's healthy, mine's strong. So, but that takes time. So, from that perspective, I think people, if they're triggered, they need to put it away, use it only if it's a work thing. Don't sit on it for hours scrolling, because that's not going to help your mental health or your metabolic health. And then you're just probably going to go to the fridge and eat things that you know that you shouldn't eat.
Yeah, perfect storm. And I see it the same way. So many things in our lives are tools, and social media certainly is. And yeah, if you've developed the frameworks and your own mental fortitude to be able to leverage the tool in a way that benefits you, it can be very powerful. But yeah, a lot of people are not coming from it from that perspective. And now what I worry about is it starts from such a young age. And
Does
so I look at kids now who have no resilience, no
no.
robustness. They can't cope with many things. And we've created this culture of safety and sheltering kids, but yet they have the entire internet at their fingertips, which
I
often
know.
is not well controlled. And it's a scary thought to think about what these kids are going to sort of grow into and how we overcome what's sort of happening right now.
Well, my concern is just that brain overload and using that dopamine without earning it, because really dopamine is meant to be earned. Like, if you go for a good run or a good walk or even eating, primal based food, that feels good. You're earning it, right? Whereas if you're sitting on a phone in your room all the time, that's just using your dopamine over and over. So what's going to happen is your threshold becomes more and more and more. So you have to do it more and more. Um, I've got a 18-year-old son this year, and a 13-year-old daughter, and it's very different looking at the capacities of their use. So, for example, my son, can't really control him, he's nearly 18, but with my daughter, she's very aware of, like, when she's had enough, and she's like, no, I know that's not about me or the things that she watches. But it is a very big minefield for parents, especially I think parents in my age group, because I think we're the first generation of parents to go through with children with these huge amounts of social media and Snapchat. Like, what is that? Like, seriously, like,
Yeah.
my goodness, right?
Yeah.
I was just saying to my son on the weekend, I said, that's why we grew up in the 80s. Nothing was recorded. Nothing
Yeah.
was ever,
Thankfully.
ever right.
Yeah.
But it's just a learning process. Like I said, it's a great tool, but mentally, I think we're going to have to look at the next 5 to 10 years of really the outcomes of what this use is doing. And I think also in schools, I know here in Australia, like when they start prep, they have iPads. To me,
Mm.
that is just madness. And then we wonder why children can't write properly or hold a pen.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a big,
It's
big shift happening with a lot of those things now, and a lot of skills and things that we're slowly losing. And, again, most things are a tool. iPad's a tool, but yeah, there's a time and a place for all of them.
absolutely. And it's a protocol that I go through with my clients, even with adults. If they're in bed and they've got their light in front of them, they wonder why they can't sleep properly. I'm like, well, that's going to stuff up your circadian rhythm, and it's going to, your melatonin doesn't work properly. And even just getting people out in the sun in the morning, just sit out the sun, eat your eggs, get your face in the sun for 10 to 15 minutes. It's just all of that too. Whereas, generationally now children, which I call the indoor generation, because they're just indoors all the time. And then we wonder why they're sadly on medication at 8.
Yeah, and even increasing rates of childhood obesity and diabetes, all these things now. And that's where the ancestral health perspective comes in,
Yes.
because it realigns all the things that we're supposed to have. So, being
It
outside, fresh air,
yes.
natural sunlight cycles, all of those things that people don't think of, and that affects health, mental health, everything. So, yeah, it's such an important concept that if we can just start to align our modern lives a little bit more with our ancestral past, it can make such a significant difference. But it's a
Huge.
process, like so many things.
It is, and it's just learning how to live in a new state of being. And one of the other things, with clients, once they've kind of got into that rhythm and they've really reversed a lot of, their mental and metabolic issues that they've had, it could be a year down the track, and I hear from them and they're like, oh my gosh, I went out and I had some sourdough bread and then I felt depressed for 4 days, but that's okay. Now I know that I'm like, great. They weren't attaching it. They were like, oh, to see, coming from a very different space. So, when I always say, if we're going to add things back in, do it one at a time, see how you feel, own that feeling. Now, if you feel, and that's why I don't drink, because if I have red wine within 2 hours, my heart is literally like I've got palpitations. And then for 4 days after that, I just feel flat and really kind of, to put a label on it, depressed.
Mm.
So we've got to take notice of those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's always the first step for people. So many people go through their day just like you said, unconscious about what's happening to them, and life is just sort of happening and they're not aware of anything. So it's such an important first step for people to first just be aware of what's happening, how things in your life actually affect you, and then
Yeah.
you can start to manipulate different things so that you can start to feel better. But that first step is always a tricky first step for people.
Absolutely. And especially with women too, the power of fat. We need fat for our hormones. And that's especially too, and it's really critical. A lot of people don't talk about it, but when women go through menopause and the menopausal symptoms we've told that are meant to be normal, and they're not normal. That's because your adrenal glands aren't being supported with what uses adrenal glands, cholesterol. So, when your sex hormones stop working, your adrenal glands pick up that. So, you really, as a primal person, you should just go through menopause. It's no problem because your diet is assisting your adrenals.
It's that aspect again of what is common isn't necessarily normal. That
No.
people, again, they don't associate that, and we don't have to look back too far. Like we said, 1 or 2 generations ago, so many of these things weren't present, but yet now it's honestly, I'm always quite amazed actually at how easily the human mind is able to adapt to its current states, and
Yes.
that just becomes the new norm. And so, like, Viktor Frankl, if people are familiar, obviously that's such an extreme example of
Yeah.
how humans adapt to extreme environments, and that just becomes normal for them,
Yes.
and you can just operate at that level. But yeah, eventually it obviously will have some detriment. It's just a matter of how long.
When.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Correct. And it's right. It's a reflective back on, if you're eating a really sad diet, you will adapt to that and you will become, that's your new normal. And it's not until you start to open the window even slightly and then your body starts to send you feedback. And then you're like, whoa, I never knew that that was actually possible or capable of operating like that.
Yeah.
And most people, that you've probably spoken to or even heard, once they transition into that primal state, I have so many people say to me, I've got so much energy. I don't know what to do with it. That's great.
Yeah. Good problem to have.
I know, right? And they're like, I'm even sleeping less, but I'm sleeping deeper and it's just so much better. And I'm waking and I'm bouncing out of bed. I'm like, yay.
Yeah. That's what we want. Hopefully more and more people start to make that shift and realize that, yeah, they can operate at that level consistently. But I
Yes.
think
And
we've
throw organs into your diet, people. I know some
yes.
people in the carnivore community are like, oh, you don't need organs. You do.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously,
They're
we're
just
proponents of
superfood.
that. Absolutely. They're going to have
Yeah.
some particular nutrients which are not necessarily going to be as abundant in
Yep.
muscle meat. You can get away with it.
Yep.
But I think if you want to formulate a really well-rounded nutritional approach, then yeah, they each sort of serve their role.
Yeah, oh, they do. I love people are probably cringe when I say this, but I eat raw liver every morning. It's about a
Amazing.
teaspoonful. And you can literally feel within about an hour, you can feel your energy change. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's one of those things we've lost where not too long ago, that was the norm.
That
We
was
had
my
it all the
normal too
time.
as a kid. I didn't
Yep.
eat it raw. My grandmother gave it to me cooked, but
Yeah. Lamb's
um,
fry and things like that.
oh, I love ox heart now. I still eat lamb's hearts and liver. I don't eat it cooked anymore. I just eat it raw because it's easier.
Yep.
But I don't chew it. Don't chew it, people. Don't chew it.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely
Don't chew it.
if you don't enjoy the texture and the palate of it, you're gonna want to avoid that for
You
sure.
will never do it again. That's
Yeah.
why I say to people, just get it on a spoon, put it in your mouth, wash it down with water, and you're done.
Yeah. That's a much easier
Yeah.
way of doing it.
And it's great. Folate, it's got so many things in it.
Yeah, nutritional powerhouse. They all have their own sort of particular nutrient profiles, which can
They
be
do.
really beneficial. Liver is obviously sort of the all-rounder that
Yes.
covers a lot of components, and obviously the main nutrients we talked about in relation to mental health, B12, iron
B12,
being
yep.
such core components. You're not really going to get a better source than organs. Obviously, spleen is going to be the richest source of heme iron. So
Yes.
women particularly suffering with anemia, iron deficiency anemia, that can be such a beneficial product to
Oh,
include.
it's huge,
Mhm.
huge. And tallow.
Yes.
I
Get
do
plenty
love
of
your
get
tallow.
plenty
I
of
will
tallow.
say that. It's
Beautiful.
amazing. So good.
Excellent. Yeah, it's for cooking. And we actually have people in the carnivore space who just eat it straight.
Yeah,
So if
I have
they're
heard that.
keto, yep, if they need to get their calories in or they need to hit their sort of threshold of fat to
Yep.
be in that ketosis state, then
Yes.
some people will just spoon it. I've done it in the past. Again, it's one of those things that depends on how easily you can handle certain foods because it's
Yeah.
definitely not for everyone, but
No.
it's an easy way to get it in.
Great for your skin though, too. Like I've
Yep.
put it on my skin as
Yeah,
well.
we actually have quite a few people who use it as skincare.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's a whole host of products now creating tallow-based, and again, it's one of those things that we're going back to the ancestral approach. We
Yes.
used to create most things out of fat and tallow. So
Correct.
I've got tallow soap, I've got tallow moisturizer,
It's
basically everything.
amazing.
Yep. Avoid all the
Yeah.
toxins, go back to our
Yeah.
natural stuff.
Again, what we're talking about before, environment. Really be mindful of what you're putting on your skin, what you're putting in your skin, and what you're absorbing. Even go as far as be careful of what water you're drinking. Don't drink tap water.
Yeah,
That also too
please.
is a protocol of, a part of that shift, what I talk to about my clients as well, because a lot of people sadly actually don't know how bad tap water is. So yeah, it's another component of environment.
Yeah, yeah. So many rabbit holes we can open up. I'm sure there's a lot to think about, and that's where it's important, I think, to find a clinician or a practitioner that is sort of trained or at least has background in that more
Yeah.
ancestral approach and functional approach that looks at everything holistically. Because unfortunately, in the modern world now, there are so many things we need to be cognizant of
Yeah.
that we've got to try to put as many things in place to sort of counter the comfort lifestyle that we've created.
Yeah. And value mental and metabolic health. And that has to be rewired because a lot of people don't own that.
Mm,
Because, they've never felt a certain way. And once you feel a certain way and you value that, you'd never go back. And that's the thing. Yeah, it's a very powerful space to be in.
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a core place that people need to start from. It's probably a good place to close it up. And from that, do you
Yeah.
have any last sort of little tips or strategies that you find work really well for people who, are looking to make a shift that you find you use with a lot of your clients that can really help move them into that space?
Yeah, look, I really think it's just also about people questioning, why am I doing what I'm doing? Like, why do I eat what I eat when I know that it doesn't make me feel good? And, we've got information externally, and that also can create, as we said, a little bit of, conflict. But I think I'd love people to really understand, okay, what is the relationship with myself? Do I love myself? Do I respect myself? Am I kind to myself? Do I hold myself accountable? Really think about those things. And I think when people hear that, they'll probably feel a little bit of resistance or a bit of a reaction, because it's the unconscious conflict going, oh, well, no, probably not. So own that and then really look at, the reasons behind the why. But it has to be mental and metabolic. Never use a diet to make your body, force your body to lose weight or to reverse something that you have to actually understand, one, where it comes, where it's steeped from, and two, how to ancestrally reverse those through the proper way of eating.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you for the wise
Thanks,
words.
Richard.
If anyone does want to work with you, where can they find you and where can they follow you?
Yeah, so Instagram is natalie.e.west and Facebook same, and also to my website, so natalieewest.com. So it's double E. And there's a little service tab where it says, let's start here. So that's like a 30-minute free chat with me if anything that's resonated. And we can go from there and go through the process and to see if there's a fit.
Great. Well, I'm sure there's lots of people that will resonate with that and hopefully are ready to make a shift towards their mindset and moving towards better health.
Superhuman version of yourself. Unleash it.
Love it.
Because it is there.
It is. It is there for everyone.
Yeah, it is.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Natalie.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. And if you're looking to add in nature's most nutrient-dense foods back into your diet, be sure to check out vitalorigin.com.au and use coupon SOURCE10 at checkout for an extra 10% off. We'll see you guys on the next episode.